It is my task here today to make sure that we don't exceed the time schedule, so I'm going to be really strict. But I have lost already like 10 minutes or something. No problem at all. Welcome to the second day of the ERSA Congress here in Groningen. Welcome on behalf of Paul Erhorst, who is the chair of the local organizing committee, and also welcome on behalf of Jouke Dijkstra, Professor of Regional Labour Market Analysis, and also the President of ERSA, the European Regional Science Association. My name is Barbara Baarsma, and I am the chair of today's plenary session. The theme of the Congress is social progress in resilient regions. And today, ERSA shows that not only regions can be resilient, but also organizations can be resilient. This is the 57th Congress of ERSA, but even at this respectable age, the ERSA Congress organizations has come up with a novelty. It has made an innovation. For the first time in the 57th year history of the ERSA Congresses, the program now has a policy day. And I think that is a great idea. It's not purely about academics, it's not about scientists talking together about the details of this and that model, but it's also about policy. What are we going to do with the scientific knowledge? How are we going to use that knowledge to invest in social progress and so on? And as an applied economist, working both in science, policy, and on the normal labor market, I like that very much. So it's an honor to be here, and I'm very enthusiastic also to be able to chair this great plenary session. I'm also, and there's a second reason why I am very enthusiastic to be here, and that's because of the city of Groningen. You must know that I was made here. My parents studied in Groningen. I was not born here, just made here. So I don't know very much. I have no memories of that, luckily. But anyhow, I still feel there's a connection between me and Groningen. But the most important reason why I'm enthusiastic about being here today and chairing this plenary session is, of course, that the program is very, very interesting. The ERSA Congress organization has set up really a very rich program for today. Yesterday was already rich. If I looked at the booklet and I saw on the Congress site how many papers have been presented yesterday, and also tomorrow there will be even also another day. But today, if I read at the website, the theme of today, and I quote from the website, in a world of rapid economic and technological change, resilient regions with sustainable socio-economic structures and institutions are more important for social progress and development than ever. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Today we discuss which policies are effective and which policies are not effective when investing in social progress in regions in economic and demographic decline. And I think there are so many questions to be answered. Do investment in infrastructure help to increase resilience? Does it help to increase regional economic growth? And what is the role of social inequality in striving for economic growth? All of these questions, I hope that you will find answers either in these plenary sessions, but also perhaps in one of the policy sessions afterwards. These and well, many other questions will be answered today. Here at this moment we have this plenary session with three very, very good keynote speakers, Marc Lemaitre, Joachim Oliveira Martin, and Pim van Ballekom. But after the three keynotes, so not after every keynote, but after the three gentlemen have spoken, I will come and stand in between you and give the floor to you to pose short questions. So please write your questions down if you have a question after the keynote speak of Marc Lemaitre and so Every keynote will take about 20 minutes, and as I said, it's my task to make sure that they do not exceed that time given to them, so that there's time for you to ask questions. What I would like to do now is give the floor to the first keynote speaker, and he has, this year he celebrates his 10-year anniversary of working for European institutions. He started working there in 2007, isn't it? True. Yeah. He speaks 6 languages, also Dutch. And today he will talk in English about regional science and cohesion policy. I gladly give the floor to Marc Lemaitre, who is the Director General of DG Regional and Urban Policy at the European Commission. Thank you very much for being here.
Barbara, thank you very much. Let me start by emphasizing how delighted I am to be here today, and in fact you stole many of my introductory lines, because it is for similar reasons to the ones you mentioned that I really was thrilled when, I will not hide from you, discovering yesterday only the breadth of this event. It got me extremely excited because I believe that especially today, when it's not that easy to understand the world and it's not that easy to understand what to do as a public policy maker, it is more important than ever to try to gather as much evidence as possible. And as complicated as it is, to try to look through the haze. And I was admittedly surprised to discover how vibrant a scene we have in academic circles across Europe, looking at a field in its various aspects, which is extremely dear to my heart, and probably I'll say a word about it towards the end, when moving on to where we stand in the European Commission on preparing possible programs for the future being after 2020, because internal dynamics in the Commission are also interesting, I think, from that point of view. But certainly, generally, I would say the European Commission, as a public policy body, is not among the worst in trying to look at the evidence first before thinking about policy. But I believe that there is scope still for improvement also in the European Commission. And having joined DG Regional Policy, as it is called, Regional and Urban Policy, I was relieved to see how tight the links were with the outside world, with the academic world, and that we were really listening to the latest thinking outside in order to further our own reflection. And I'd like today basically to expose to you through 4 very important topics for the future, I think, of European regional policy, to expose to you what kind of influences we have been subject to from academic or research work. So the 4 areas I'd like to expand on are first the quality of government. Second, something which I believe is a sibling of that, or possibly a subset of that, the area of structural reforms generally. Third, what is still a rather novel concept, I would say, when thinking of the time usually it takes to go from academic thought to real policy and real world translation, smart specialization, concept, if I'm not wrong, which emerged around 2007, 2008. And finally, the notion which has been known for quite a while and has been theorized for quite a while at country level, but a bit less at regional level, the notion of the middle income trap. And on all those topics, I would also try then to give some indications on where our thinking goes, not only for the immediate future, but for proposals after 2020, which we are reflecting on right now. And I would end then with a few further thoughts on the proposals which we are meant to make next year for post-2020, as we call it. Quality of government first. There is rich evidence by now that quality of government and poor quality of government is extremely damaging to economic growth generally. And that this damage cannot be really compensated by pouring money into public infrastructure, transport, or others. And I would want here to refer to work from the LSE, and in particular Professor Andres Rodriguez Pose, who gave some strong evidence there that one has in fact to really try to go to the root of the problem, which is about the poor quality of government. We were helped in our thinking also by the emergence of new sets of data, and more specifically a regional index on quality of government, which has been produced for us by the Gothenburg University. And this is one of those areas where we have managed to dissipate the haze somewhat on that by finally obtaining some regional data sets, which are very useful. And progressively now, because this is work which started also some years ago, we are seeing a more and more precise picture. We have two data sets from 2010 and from 2013, and I am very glad to share with you that we will have a third one, which will be coming out next month in a publication of the European Commission, which is very close, in fact, to an academic paper, I would say, in its nature. And it's the 3-yearly cohesion report, as we call it, which we produce every 3 years, and which is now due out next month. And it will contain another set of data on quality of government at regional level, as I said. Then we have what is a wider area of structural reforms. Absolutely critical too. We have loads of evidence since the crisis in particular. Critical for ultimately achieving what is the goal of European regional policy, i.e. to have catching up by the less developed regions of Europe and catching up of a sustainable nature, which again the crisis showed was not always the case until now. So essential for improving productivity levels and employment growth. We have published in May this year a communication on what we call lagging regions. There are two categories which we have defined there. One is about regions which today are still very, very far away from the EU average in terms of GDP per head, but it is because they started very low. These regions tend today to be developing pretty well. It's mostly regions from Central Europe. And then we have a second category, which are regions which for the past decades already have stubbornly refused to catch up with the rest. And there we are talking mostly about regions of the southern Mediterranean. In this report on lagging regions, we have identified that they suffer more than other regions from poor regulations. And this is sometimes also linked, in fact, to the quality of administration. And this leads to economic structures where firms tend to be small, remain small, not be internationally oriented, not be export oriented, and these small firms are also the ones ultimately who struggle most with a bad regulatory environment. And here I'd like to thank Joachim, in fact, because we have for this report been helped very much by work from the OECD. For the immediate future, to try to improve on things in such regions, we have launched, in fact, with the EIB, the EBRD, and the World Bank, different new pilot actions, as I would call them, because I wouldn't want to claim that this would be, at this stage, a full rollout. And we have tried again to improve on our understanding and knowledge, especially in the area of ease of doing business. So in that area, the World Bank produced for us a first study covering 3 member states, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, going regional. You know their ease of doing business survey, and here we benefited from extra work of theirs to also spot differences, which are significant, very significant, within those three member states. We have already now a very concrete initiative launched in Poland and in Romania, covering in each case two specific regions. It is very labor intensive. It's a hands-on approach, and it is meant to try to tackle some very specific weaknesses. Just to give you one example, we have in one of the two eastern Polish regions we are targeting, we saw that there was a total mismatch between what the private sector required in terms of vocational training and what was generally available. And in that instance, we have helped public authorities together with vocational training centers to better understand the needs of the local economy and to set up a voucher scheme for private businesses to avail themselves of such vocational training offers, which would be then fitting their needs much better. These are very targeted actions, but which look extremely promising. We will have to think about how to achieve wider dissemination and wider coverage of such approaches, which in fact intellectually I compare with the smart specialization approach. You know, ultimately it is about doing what the Netherlands has been so good at for many decades now, and it is putting together the various actors, and mostly it is local government, talking here about regional difficulties, local government, the private sector, the academic sector, when it comes to smart specialization, research institutes as well, sometimes civil society, and to find out together what the problem is and what the solution to that problem might be. But it's hard work. We will be progressing further on understanding these regional differences within member states by adding, again through World Bank work, further member states to the list. So next year we're going to have data on Croatia, Czech Republic, Portugal, and Slovakia. Another survey which will be extremely helpful to us to understand the needs in terms of structural reforms beyond the usual targets we have through the European semester and so on. So again, looking regionally. Another survey will be on what enterprises at regional level consider to be the main problems, the main hurdles to their own development. Results of that survey should be coming out next year and the year after, and it should provide evidence on on really what the source of difficulties for development of the private sector are, whether it is indeed perhaps bad administration, red tape, corruption, access to finance, lack of the right type of skilled labor, among others. And this should help us then have a clearer picture. In this area
about 2 more minutes.
I have 2 more minutes.
Yeah.
Gosh, thank you for reminding me. I try to be then extremely brief, and indeed we should have more time for interaction. To us, this is a crucial area. Structural reforms, we need in Europe a way to stimulate structural reforms, much more. To have many more positive incentives than today, because we see that Europe seems to be incapable of reforming itself in good times, when it should go for the hard reforms. And we will be thinking about that very hard for the future. Smart specialization, I mentioned, again, something which came from academia and I think which has been an incredible success story in Europe. We went from theory to practice in very condensed times. We have just brought out a communication on this in July, taking stock of the situation. I must say, very proud that regional policy, in fact, allowed for the smart specialization approach to be rolled out all across European regions. We have more than 130 now, and what we need now is to build on that for the future, and in particular look at inter-regional cooperation. Cooperation between regions which are looking in the same direction, which have strengths along the same value chain, and which can benefit from cooperation. This is today the weak spot, because smart specialization started in an introverted way. The middle income trap, there I would just refer to recent work by LSE colleagues. One of them I have already mentioned. This study is available on our website. In fact, we think it has a lot of conclusions which are really extremely relevant for our thinking for the future. So I would encourage you to look into that, and certainly we will be inspired by that. And then I'd finish in a telegraphic form on the proposals we are preparing for the future. The context is extremely complicated because of the dimension of the UK withdrawal and the earth-shattering effect it will be having on the EU budget, its financing overall. In such a context, my belief is that more than ever we need to look at evidence and what is required at European level, where we can make a real difference. And there are huge tensions within the Commission between the centralized, I would say, sectorial approaches and the specificities of a policy like regional policy, where we entrust action to the local level, and where we trust them to have a holistic approach to their difficulties and to take account of their specific situations. So this is an interesting internal debate we will be having, and I am very glad that we are helped so well by this rich work on the academic side, which you are embodying here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You are a champion in speeding up. Really. Because I saw how many pages there were still left. I thought, ooh, this is going to be what? But you succeeded very well. Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. Let me now introduce the second keynote speaker of this plenary session. He had an impressive career at the OECD. He headed the Division of Regional Development and Policy and is now a special advisor to the Center of the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship. He's also associate professor at the University of Paris Dauphine, and today we'll talk about the contribution of regions and cities to inclusive growth. Welcome to Joachim, Olivier and Martin. The floor is yours.
Good morning, thank you very much. I'm really very pleased to be here. Thank you for this great opportunity and also to visit again this great city of Groningen. Huh? I really enjoy this kind of atmosphere that exists in this city. So my presentation is about inclusive growth, and I don't think I have to explain to you how this is important in the context of both very low productivity performance across the OECD and also these mounting inequalities a bit sort of everywhere. So the idea, this holy grail, in some sense, is getting both growth and a bit more of equity, a bit more of this equity in the system. I believe, and the OECD believes, that the regional policies could give an important contribution to this issue of inclusive growth. So let me do it in 3 steps. First, I talk about growth, then I talk about inclusion, and then I will talk at the end about policies. So, growth. The first point that we have stressed in the OECD about growth is this idea that when you decompose the performance of growth and productivity in 2 parts, the frontier is basically the places which have the highest level of productivity, right? And we define this frontier with something that covers at least 10% of the population, because we want to avoid this kind of strange idiosyncrasies that in some countries, a very strange region, because it does mining or something like that, may have a very high level of productivity, okay? So it's 10% of the population. This corresponds to the regions which have the highest benefit from the highest level of productivity. And then you have all the rest. And when you do these numbers for the whole OECD as a whole, you do see this kind of widening gap between this frontier and the rest. And the rest is not only the kind of a bottom 10%, even if you take the rest as the 75 sort of bottom distribution, you still find this kind of increasing gap. And if you compare between, say, 95 to recent years, this gap has increased by something around 60%. So clearly there is a sense of a pattern of this regional divergence in terms of productivity in the OECD. Now, if you look at the different types of OECD regions in terms of these productivity dynamics, then there are kind of, we could classify things into 4 groups. First of all, you have the frontier regions, the ones which have the highest level of productivity. Then there is a second group which is catching up to this frontier. So these are the converging, in some sense, regions. Then you have the regions which are more or less in a kind of keeping pace. So the gap between their levels of productivity and the frontier remain more or less stable. And then there are the regions which are diverging from the frontier. So there are these kind of 4 groups. So it's interesting to see what is the contribution to growth and employment is these 4 different types of productivity dynamics. So if you take the 2 kind of nice situations, the ones who benefit from the highest levels of productivity and the ones which are catching up to this frontier, so this accounts roughly for 50% of OECD GDP growth. But the other 50% is located in regions which are either keeping pace. So if they are keeping pace but very close to the frontier, this is not bad. But if they are keeping pace and they're very far from the frontier, this is not good news. And for example, in the UK is in the OECD the country which displays these highest differences in productivity levels across regions. So the regions in the UK which are keeping pace with London are not in a very good situation, right? So both the regions which are keeping pace and the regions which are diverging from the frontier account for roughly 50% of GDP. So if we could do something to generate a bit more of this catching up in these groups, would certainly have a very strong impact for aggregate productivity growth. So this idea here is really to connect the regional performance to the aggregate productivity performance of countries. What is even more striking is that 60% of employment in the OECD is located in these regions which are either sort of diverging or are in this kind of a steady or keeping pace type of productivity performance. So this is kind of important, right? 60% of the people working in these regions which are not doing very well in terms of productivity, and of course, in countries where the workforce is aging, productivity is the name of the game, right? Growth is ultimately determined by productivity mainly. So, if we look at these fabrics of productivity inside countries, and let's now focus a bit on Europe. I was a bit struck. We did a paper that actually presented in this Cohesion Forum recently in Brussels. We did it with John Batchelor, Peter Vosner and Piotr Zuber, and we look at a bit this productivity dynamics within Europe, and I was really struck because you do find actually two types of countries. Countries where this convergence, this productivity catching up is a very important element of the overall productivity picture. So I mean that the overall productivity of the country, so I'm talking here, by the way, in terms of labor productivity, because unfortunately at the regional level, we don't have enough data to talk about total factor productivity. But, you know, total factor productivity is pretty much determined by what's going on in terms of course, of labor productivity. And labor productivity is determined by total factor productivity. So looking and one and another, you don't kind of miss a lot. But you know, this is it. In the OECD, we don't have good investment and capital data at the regional level to compute total factor productivity. So saying that, you have countries where this national labor productivity growth is pretty much determined by this convergence, by this catching up at the regional level. So this I call it the group one. You find in group one countries like Austria, Germany, Czech Republic, Spain, Italy, Poland, Portugal, Romania. Then there is group two. The group two are countries where pretty much what's going on in terms of labor productivity growth at the country level is concentrated in basically one region, the frontier region. So basically pretty much what is going on in terms of productivity performance for the country as a whole is determined by the performance of a single region. So these are countries like Bulgaria, Denmark, France, UK, Finland, Greece, Hungary, Netherlands, Slovak Republic, or Sweden. These two groups actually pretty much balance in terms of composition. You find big countries, you find Germany, France, each group. You find sort of intermediate countries like Spain, Italy, Sweden, or Denmark. You find countries in Eastern European region. You find a country like Slovakia pretty much concentrated, a country like Romania much less sort of concentrated. You find countries like Portugal in the kind of a more group driven by regional catching up. Greece, which is totally concentrated in the region of Athens. So actually these two groups are pretty much balanced in terms of composition. So what's going on now country by country in this type of groups? So let's start with group one. So Germany, for example, Germany and Austria. So the picture is pretty much kind of clear. If you decompose the labor productivity growth by the contributions of the different regions, you see that in a country like Germany, most of the productivity growth is not generated in the frontier. The frontier in these charts is indicated by black sort of a color. So the frontier in Germany, in the Hesse and Hamburg, is not generating aggregate productivity growth. What is generating aggregate productivity growth in Germany is actually the catching up of the regions which are lagging behind. The picture, for example, for Austria is even more striking. You know, Vienna, the region of Vienna has the highest level of labor productivity, but is not generating growth in the country. What is generating growth in the country is the catching up of the regions. And you could go on. If you could look at Spain and Italy, it's a bit the same. Growth in Spain is not, the growth of productivity is not generated in Madrid. Growth of productivity in Italy is not generated in the region of Rome. Growth in Poland is not generated mainly in the region where Warsaw is located. It's generated elsewhere in the country, and in particular by the regions which are in this catching up mode. Same for my little country. The productivity performance of Portugal has been pretty much flat since the last 15 years in Portugal, right? But the little productivity that we had at the country level was actually generating by the catching up of the north and the central region, by the way, with a tremendous labor adjustment cost. The loss of employment in these two regions has been, with a huge magnitude for the size of the country. If you look at the Czech Republic, you find actually some contribution of the frontier, the black one, for this overall productivity performance. In Romania also a little bit, but pretty much is still this regional catching up with generating the aggregate labor productivity growth. Now, let's move to the second group. The most iconic example of the second group is France. So if you decompose the labor productivity growth in France, over there, it's Paris. Actually, it's not Paris, it's the region of Paris, which is Île-de-France, which embodies this huge metropolitan area with approximately 12 million people. So everything that generates in terms of growth of productivity in France is generated there. I'm not saying there is no productivity on Bordeaux, Lyon, or Marseille, but the growth is generated in Paris. And basically, most of the other regions are actually diverging in terms of productivity vis-à-vis Paris. If you look at UK, it's pretty much the same thing. It's London and the rest. If you look at Sweden, even a country which is characterized by a very sort of a balanced and equal type of social system, is a country which pretty much, in terms of productivity, is really the Stockholm area which generates most of it. You look at Denmark, it's a bit the same. You look at Greece, everything that happens in terms of productivity in Greece is the region of Attica. You look at Hungary, everything is located in this region of Budapest. You look at Bulgaria, the same. You look at Slovakia, most of this Slovakia has been the champion of productivity growth in the OECD. All this productivity growth of Slovakia is concentrated in the region of Bratislava. The other regions are not really catching up. So it's pretty much kind of interesting that in a country even like the Netherlands, where we are, pretty much the productivity performance of the country is generated in the frontier, and actually Groningen belongs to this frontier of productivity, belongs to this productivity performance of the country. So the North Holland and Groningen are the ones driving the aggregate productivity performance. The others are basically contributing in a negative way. So if you look to the map of Europe in terms of this productivity dynamic, it looks a bit like that. So the black are the frontier regions, the light blue are the regions which are diverging, the dark blue are the regions which are converging, and the striped are the regions which are more or less keeping pace. So in the middle of the map there is France, and the map of France is basically one region and everybody else diverging. So are these models of productivity, the fabrics of productivity at the regional level, having impact at the aggregate level? Let's compare the productivity of these two types of countries. So type 1 and type 2 being the more concentrated one. So this is the average growth of labor productivity in the two groups of country. We don't see much of a difference. So this is our weighted labor productivity growth rates. So pretty much the two curves follow more or less the same pattern. You see that actually the second group, the more concentrated group, has a bit more of a higher average rate of productivity. You have 1.07 in the first group, 1.12 in the second group. So there's a bit of an edge in terms of productivity in the second group. If we look at the unweighted average of this country growth rates, you find a bit of a difference also between the type 1 and type 2, 1.25, 1.34. So this concentrated model seems to deliver a bit better in terms of aggregate productivity, right? So is there a trade-off between this productivity performance as the countries as a whole and this kind of a regional balance? So let's look now on the inclusion. So how the patterns of regional conversion look like in these two groups of countries. So basically this is, for the two groups of countries, the frontier, the evolution of the level of productivity in the frontier, and the evolution of the productivity level in all other regions. So 10% is the frontier, 90% is all other regions. So if you look at the type 1 countries, basically what you see is indeed there was a bit of catching up, because this regional catching up is playing a role at the country level. So the frontier is doing 0.95 average growth over this period, 2000-2015. And the lagging regions have grown a little bit more than the frontier, so there is a bit of catching up. So, okay, there is a bit of narrowing of this gap. If you look at the second group, the group where there is concentration, so it's obvious, the frontier is doing much better than the other regions. So the frontier is growing at 1.4 and the others are growing at 1.09. So actually in this group there was divergence. So convergence versus divergence. So this is, if you look at the TL2 corresponds more or less with the NUTS2 type of level. If you look at with a sort of a more granular data at the TL3 level, which corresponds more or less to the NUTS3, you see more or less the same picture. The numbers are a bit bigger because you have more granular data. But basically in the first group you have this convergence, so the frontier growing at 1%, the others growing at 1.1, and in the concentrated group, the frontier growing much faster than the lagging regions at 1.8 and the others basically growing at 0.9. So convergence, divergence. If you look now on inequalities, this is about productivity. If we look about inequalities, so one simple measure of measuring inequalities is just basically to compare the Gini coefficients at the country level. So because these are groups, you need to make an average of it. So either you can weight the average or have a simple average. So if you have a weighted average for the TL2 NUTS2, you find this picture that indeed the level of regional inequalities in the first group remain more or less stable, and actually they have increased in the second group. If you do the simple averages, actually this increase in regional inequalities is a bit more marked, stronger, you see it's stronger. And you do see indeed that this increase of regional inequalities as mainly, the action was mainly before the crisis. So clearly the concentrated model generates more inequality, this kind of normal. And if you do it at the TL3 level, you find a bit the same thing. So at the end of these facts, and the OECD is always a bit boring, we kind of like to start with facts, but it seems to be a bit of a trade-off, right, between this efficiency and the equity, which economists are used to, right? What is interesting is that these things also map at the city level, and we have done a lot of work in the OECD to look at these numbers at the level of metropolitan areas, and you also find, for example, a bit of a trade-off between the size of cities and the level of inequalities. The bigger cities tend to be more unequal. If you also compare the change in the Gini coefficients in city with the growth rates of GDP per capita in cities, you do find that a lot of cities that did very well, I mean, by growing the GDP per capita above average, are cities where actually the inequalities have increased. Only 20% of the metropolitan areas in the OECD doing this trick of generating both growth and less inequality. So doing what we want, inclusive growth, right? So the question now is, what is the kind of lessons or questions, mainly questions for policy? So first, there seems to be a bit of a trade-off. It's not very big. There is a difference of productivity performance between the type 1 and type 2, but it's not very big, but it's there. So there seems to be a trade-off between this productivity performance and regional inequalities. I think regional policy should help transform these trade-offs into synergies. This is already the job of regional policy. Also, in the regions or countries where you find this importance of the regional productivity catching up, so this is an important strategy for the country growth as a whole. So the countries where indeed this regional catching up play a role should pay strong attention to regional policy, because this is where productivity growth of the country as a whole is generated. For the countries where you have very high territorial symmetries, a country like France, well, perhaps they should ask themselves if there are some untapped productivity catching up outside, say in France, like outside Paris, that could be mobilized. And again, this should be a role of regional policy. So, what kind of policies generate this inclusive growth? First of all, we don't see any kind of trade-off between cities and rural areas. Actually, the linkages between cities and rural areas are a generator of productivity catching up. If we decompose regions by predominantly urban, predominantly intermediate, predominantly rural close to cities, and predominantly rural remote, it's pretty clear the rural regions which are close to cities grow more and then converge. So there is no trade-off, there is no contradiction between being rural and being urban. On the contrary, these two types of regions are very complementary, and these linkages need to be managed, not only in terms of infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but also soft infrastructure in terms of managing these partnerships between rural and urban areas. Another important role for regional policy is that the tradable sector seems to be a big motor engine driver of this regional productivity catching up. We find in our regional outlook 2016 that the regions which are in this catching up mode are regions where tradable sectors are more present. And even the chief economist of the OECD, and this was the first time actually the chief economist of the OECD was finally looking at regional dimensions in the OECD economic outlook, not the OECD regional outlook. The OECD economic outlook presented in ministerial meeting in June, he presented this chart showing that actually a change in the manufacturing employment is related at the country level with actually a higher increase of regional inequalities. So it's very important. I'm not saying that regional policy should promote, should become now a sort of industrial policy, but at least the regional policy should not hinder the incentives to remain in the tradable sector. I'm saying that because in many countries there was so much investment that was directed towards the non-tradable sector that perhaps this hinder a bit of this regional productivity catching up. Another great opportunity for doing inclusive growth are cities. We find Rudiger is over there in this team. They did a beautiful work to show that actually cities which have a less good governance system in the sense that they are very fragmented in terms of, for example, number of small little administrative units, municipalities within a big metropolitan area, these cities deliver, ceteris paribus, less productivity. But what is interesting is actually ceteris paribus, they also deliver more inequality, generate much more segregation. So actually this is a very nice opportunity by a good governance system, finishing, that you get both productivity and inclusiveness in cities. Another great opportunity for doing inclusive growth is the land use, housing market, spatial planning. Again, in the team of Rudiger and others, we did, I think, a very important project on land use last year in the OECD. We found that actually there are great, there is a great scope to improve land use policies and also generate very better coordination between land use policies and a number of other policies, like, for example, tax policies, that perhaps remove a bit of this pressure on the housing sectors, on housing prices, which is one of the bigger generator of inequalities in the middle of cities. One of the biggest inequalities now in cities is access to housing, right? And my final point is investment. One of the main policy instruments that we have is investment. And where this investment is done by regional and municipal governments. It's not done mainly by central governments. So if this is done by subnational governments, it needs to be well coordinated with central governments, regional, municipal governments. You need to have capacity to undertake these investments. You need to have framework conditions, and this was the kind of purpose of this OECD soft law recommendation on the governance of public investment across levels of government, and we also have now a toolkit for implementation of these principles at the country level for our members that want to do it. So I stop here. I could go on with a number of other things that actually could generate this inclusive growth model. For example, we have evidence that actually these structural policies that Mark referred to actually are good for regional convergence. So, but I think there is, at the end, what I really want to say is that this inclusive growth model depends a lot on what's going on in terms of regional policy. So the regional policy should really be seen as a very important structural component of these inclusive growth policies. Okay, thank you so much.
very much. I think that there might be a question on Groningen being in the frontier, and I think that your answer could have something to do with gas production. And if in your data set, it was now until 2015, I think, 2016 was included, I'm curious what the picture would have been, because due to the reduction of gas production, it may very well be in a different segment. Anyhow, let me introduce the third and last keynote speaker of today's session. He's worked at the Dutch Ministry of Finance, at APG, a large Dutch pension fund. He's worked at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, but now he is the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, and he's going to give a lecture on finance, integrated territorial development and the urban agenda. Please give a warm welcome to Pim van Ballekom.
Thank you, Barbara. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted having the opportunity to address you today here at the Policy Day of ERSA, and the more so because it's in Groningen. A very good and great innovative idea, Barbara, to introduce a Policy Day. But only when policies are drivers for investment and not a hindrance to investment, because then I hate policies. And I can give you examples until tomorrow morning, but just give me two. I visited once a very innovative company in the Netherlands. The people were proud on the innovation, I don't mention names, and had my staff with me, and they qualified for investment program of the bank because they had less than 3,000 employees, and that is policy. SMEs and mid-caps is 3,000 employees, not more. But the guy, the CFO of that company, was so proud. He said, "We are fast growing, Pim. We are a very fast-growing, innovative company. Now we have 3,140 employers." And then myself said, "We are so sorry." And that's an hindrance, because I couldn't explain. I found a solution to circumvent these policies put to us by our beloved member states, European Parliament, and even the Commission. Another example, because I was very much surprised that Groningen nowadays is in the frontier, I negotiated a support program for Groningen. But that was not feasible, and that was not accepted by the European Commission, because Groningen was the richest region in the Netherlands. I said, why? Because the gas is here? That's not for Groningen. It's for the whole of the country. And we are discussing that nowadays in another context. But it was not feasible. The poorest region in the Netherlands was Almere, because the people are not working there, they are working in Amsterdam, so they are quite poor. But Eurostat and the Commission were inflexible in correcting those statistics. If that is policies, Barbara, I'd rather do without policies. You might be wondering what the European Investment Bank is doing here, because we are a bank and we have nothing to do with science. We do, however, support not only scientific projects, but also urban and regional development by means of financing, advisory services and technical assistance. And much as we would like for the world to be different, not a lot of things can be done without money, and so banks like us will be needed in the future, I'm sure. It's good to bear in mind that the European Investment Bank is a public bank, and that is not a profit-maximizing bank, owned by the 28 member states, and we are operating, as I said, on the basis of agreed policies, guidelines and recommendations agreed by Council, Commission and Parliament, And we are indeed one of the European institutions, and that is an asset to the bank and sometimes a liability. But we have assets and liabilities in the banking institutions. We are used to that. Urban and region development is one of the core priorities of the European Union since 1958. So it is per definition also a core activity of the bank. And one of the oldest priorities. The white paper on the future of Europe makes a powerful statement about the current state of European integration and its uncertain future. Regions and cities have to deal with continuing consequences of the financial and economic crisis, as well as the migration crisis, and they have to master the concrete economic, social, demographic, and environmental demands of globalization, technical change, and digital transformation at local level. And by doing so, they make a significant contribution to a wide range of EU objectives and priorities, ranging from the promotion of jobs and growth, integration of migrants, and support of climate action. And the impetus, and I just named two, can be seen in the Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals agreed by our policymakers. Effects on regional development from natural causes are equally important as those of economic and financial causes, and sometimes it can even reinforce the effects of those disasters. Regional and urban sustainability are critical links to the communities recover when they are affected by those disasters. And investment in capacity to prevent, prepare, manage and reduce climate and other various types of risks is therefore essential for building resilient regions and cities. Also essential is strengthening the capacities of governments to plan, implement and the recovery process to deliver an effective response. The EIB is eager to support urban investment programs in various ways. A major part of the EIB activities supporting regions and cities falls under the so-called cohesion policy. As said, the support of the European cohesion policy has been at the heart of EIB operations since the foundation of 1958. It remains central to the task of the bank, but it's not only our only focus. But I'll explain that at a later stage. The EIB's strong continued commitment to support cohesion is well documented by our past lending in the 10 years. We did more than 200 billion euros of loans providing cohesion objectives. And in my opinion, this will remain an objective in the foreseeable future. The more so because of budgetary constraints, nationally and European. In all policy domains, you can identify a shift from grants and subsidies to loans and guarantees. In the new financial framework for the years after 2020, and Mark alluded to that, it is my safe guess that this trend will continue. In fact, the whole Juncker plan, the investment plan for Europe, is based on the alternative ways of financing public needs. And that is the reason why sometimes it looks magic that with a guarantee of 21 billion euros we can stimulate the European economy with an investment impetus of 350 million, but it's a very conservative leverage, I can tell you, and we are more than 80% through this program. But that is the fact. I think that is the new way we have to finance our public needs, is by lending and guarantees. And by the way, that is also important and highlighted by Marc Lemaitre. If you want to get private investors on board, you have to put more than ever, good governance in the front of your programs. If there is no good governance, then there is no private investor interested in joining forces in order to make sure you all can finance the needs you are confronted with. If good governance is lacking, there is no progress. And I think that is one of the advantages of doing business with a bank. It is not only about cheap money. Of course, the bank is cheap money. It's not only about our advisory services or technical assistance or long tenors. We can lend money for 25, 30 years. That's not a thing a commercial bank can provide. But I think when a bank, and we are never financing more than 50% of a project, when a bank is involved with our expertise, it is good for the quality of the project. If it's an investment, a viable project, I think that is for the benefit of everyone also in the region. And that is higher quality and less strength and less public money involved. I think that is the way forward, especially when one of the stupidest things ever could be decided by people is leaving the European Union. One of the things is that the UK is trying to get the EIB still on board when they are leaving the European Union, but it's also a net payer, so I think money will be scarce in the near future, and that is the reason why my bank will be more important in the future, and that is quite good. And we are trying to do that with several ways and new products, more risk-bearing products than ever before. And I visited Groningen earlier, and the governor of the King said, you know, Pim, is fine. You are financing urban transport projects in Amsterdam or Paris or London, but Groningen is small in that sense. I said, yeah, okay, fine. But there are solutions to each and every problem, because we are financing smaller investment projects via framework loans. So you put together an investment program, even for more municipalities than only Groningen. You can do that with a couple of surrounding municipalities. It can be education, healthcare, it can be urban transport, it can be rehabilitation of your parts of your city to make them more energy efficient, less polluting, and that sort of thing. And if you come forward with a 5-year program with, let's say, 5 municipalities in this region, with an investment program of around 100 million euros over 5 years, the bank can support that. Of course, we support rather one project in one city for one cause, because that is less time consuming for the people of the bank. And we are only 3,000 people, and we are doing 80 billion a year. So in that sense, we have to be quite selective. But I can assure you, we are more than willing to look in such proposals from universities, municipalities, private sector, and whatever have you. And of course, if it ticks the Sustainable Development Goals, if it is in the area of cohesion and structural fund support, it is even better. The more boxes we can tick, the better we can say to the Commission and to our shareholders, look at us. We are a green bank, we are a cohesion bank, we are doing sustainable transport. How proud you may be to have such an institution as a European institution. For a more detailed overview of our regional policy, because I have to bear in mind the time, we have brochures. Probably they are available here, but I was told it was not feasible to put it in your folder. But they are here. They are called the EU Urban Agenda Toolbox, and the other one is it's not there. I thought there were 2. Integrated Impact. If you can't find them, dears, It's on our website. So no problem whatsoever. To give you a couple of examples, because examples are running a bank, don't be hesitant. If you have an investment idea, come to the bank. My email address is on the website as well. It's quite simple. It's van balkomeib.org. Put your investment program or ideas to the... And I have a team of people who can tell you in 24 hours, two days, if it's feasible or not. Or what you have to do to make it feasible, because that is our advisory services. Sometimes people are still used, like universities, to get money from the budget. Full stop. Easy. And if the money is not there, the program will be changed, realized in another year, or spread over more years, or whatever. And then we can probably help you to realize your plans in time, in accordance to your needs. But then it has to be bankable. And there we have advisory service, and that is an advantage of a public bank. Those advisory services and those technical assistance, it's for free. If you have a program of 5 years of 100 million, and in 2 or 3 years' time, the market conditions are far better, then you come to us and say, yeah, we don't need your money anymore because it's cheaper at the neighbor's bank than at yours. It's sorry for us. There is no fees or penalties attached to that. Normally at a commercial bank, you are getting penalized. Why not? Because we are a public bank. Sometimes people in my bank are quite disappointed then if there is no drawing. I said, you know, if the public sector, if the private sector can do the investment themselves without the help and support of the public sector, then it's the better it is. Because we are never, as a public institution, driving out the private sector. So if you are disappointed, please join the private sector and say goodbye to the EIB. And that is the way we operate. In Greece, for instance, we combined 120,000 small projects across the country, including schools, museums, tourism, vocal training, research, environmental programs, water and water sanitation. And that is 120,000 things. Of course, Greece is a special case. We put more emphasis in Greece because we have to help them to overcome all their problems. But we do that everywhere. We did it in London, where they had the Olympics, and the Olympics were in the east part of London. Why? Because that was a run-down part of the city. And then we participated in that program by renovating, redeveloping this deprived area, improve the modes of transport, and whatever have you. We have helped in dedicated framework loan for post-disaster reconstruction and rehabilitation in 16 regions in Italy, and also in regions where there was a need for reconstruction of infrastructure due to earthquakes and what have you. But although the bank is a bank, and we are able to assist you in several instances, not only by framework loans, not only by direct lending, but also by our service, as I said. And the Juncker plan allowed, and that's a good policy, by the way, Barbara. The Juncker plan allowed us to put more emphasis on advisory services. And we do that in a not centralized manner, but decentralized. So our advisory services, as you can imagine, in Sofia or Bucharest, are far more substantial than our advisory services in Amsterdam. But if you need advisory services, please come to our office in Amsterdam, And if they are not in Amsterdam located, we'll fly them in from Amsterdam, if there is a plane available, to Amsterdam, and then you'll get the advice you need for this project. As said, the Pact of Amsterdam sets out key challenges for urban areas in the EU. The Pact calls specifically on the EIB to support its implementation through our lending, co-financing and advising activities. And talking to European cities, many of which are also EU EIB borrowers, about their financing need leads us at least to 3 conclusions. First, there are many new demands facing cities, and most of them, like providing housing for refugees, tackling climate change and enhancing disasters resilience, are typically non-revenue generating issues. But that doesn't make a difference to come to the bank. Sometimes investors think it has to be revenue generating, because otherwise I can't go to a bank. Yes, you can go to an EIB bank and try to get a combination of financing from the bank via loan and subsidies from the European Commission, and we call that blending, trying to make the leverage between a subsidy and a loan. And the motto of the bank is lending, blending, combining it with subsidies of the European Union, and advising. Second, many cities in Europe are debt constrained and need to make more effective use of their debt capacity. And ways to do this include financial instruments or using private sector vehicles to achieve public goals. But this is often puts a challenge on banks and on lenders, but also on the policymakers in the region in terms of good governance. Otherwise the private sector never will join forces. And there's also a shift in a mind shift. If you put the private sector into your investment plans, you have to provide them a certain yield, otherwise they don't come. As Barbara said, I worked for APG. If APG gets a yield of 1%, they are not interested. And luckily, because a part of my pension is in their hands. No, I have 3 conclusions, Barbara, and I'm on the second conclusion, now I'm the third conclusion.
Very well.
The city needs access to knowledge and information about financing possibilities, and that's the reason why I encourage you to come to the bank. I thank you for your kind attention, and if you want to put some questions to me, I'm more than willing to answer them. Thank you very much for your...
Well, this thing works. Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Oops.
It's always a very unpleasant task of being a chair that you have to cut off interesting speeches. I'm very sorry if I've been rude. Anyhow, is there somebody who would like to pose a question? Yes, I'll come to you. Please say your name and then pose a short question. So I'm not going to hand over the mic. I'm sorry.
Hi. Mathieu Stein of Utrecht University and Free University of Amsterdam. My question is for Joachim Oliveira Martins. Most of his story is based on a single statistic that is rather flawed, labor productivity or real GDP per employee. Any economist knows that capital is an important input, which would say that industry is very influenced in your measures, and productivity growth comes mostly from automation, so machinery replacing employees, which are industries which are the end of the industry life cycle and generally not so productive according to other measures. As well, these are at the risk of losing their jobs to lower income countries. There's a very rich literature that suggests the labor intensive, knowledge intensive sectors are more productive. Could you comment on the risks of basing so much of your story on a single statistics without much of regard to other evidence produced by actually many of the persons in this room?
Thank you for your interesting, not so short question, but very interesting. Perhaps comment on that right now, and then I'll come back to the other.
This is working, yeah. No, of course, I know, I fully agree with you, and I said, indeed, ideally, I would like to have total factor productivity, but we have been struggling to have even investment data at the regional level. It's very difficult. Actually, it's more difficult to have actually the investment data done by central governments at the regional level. That's much more difficult to have than the investments done by the subnational government. So I know that some investment data is available, produced, I think it was Cambridge Econometrics who produced some of this data, but no, if you look at the sectoral level, you may have huge differences indeed, of course, of different levels of capital intensity. But on the aggregate, pretty much labor productivity growth is driven by total factor productivity. And the OECD, with a database on total factor productivity at the aggregate level, country by country, showed that in a very sort of neat way. Most of the labor productivity growth is driven by total factor productivity. There is a role for capital intensity, of course, in the capital deepening, but most of it, when you look at the sort of a longer term, is really driven by total factor productivity. So looking at these numbers of labor productivity, I'm reflecting actually the evolution of total factor productivity. But I agree with your point. I know. When you focus in sort of specific regions or some countries, you might have overcome this data limitation. No, one sort of just second point is that our economies, of course, in industries, this capital deepening effect is very important, and even this real localization of manufacturing industries is pretty much driven by actually digitalization, robotization, etc., etc. But most of our economies is also service sectors, right? So perhaps this effect of capital deepening is also a bit less important on aggregate for our economies, because it's mainly services, right? So, but good point. Good point,
good answer. Next question here.
Well, I wonder whether sometimes regional policy destroyed good governance. And I think that if we look at the cohesion regions, that eventually could be the case. Because you have a lot of money coming from outside. Taxpayers don't have that money, so the politicians that are there, so that they look at this money as free money to do whatever can appear. And then you create some dependency. So I wonder if there was this case, some problems, not in the governance, but in the governance at the European level that somehow created at European and at national level, that created those policies that somehow destroy local governance. Thank you. Well, eventually our colleague from the Commission.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, your name was again?
Tomás Dentinho, from the Azores, yes.
Oh yeah, in Portugal.
Well, that's a big question. I think it's a drawback of any transfers of budgetary means. We know that indeed this can lead to a certain dependency. This can lead to possibly laziness in terms of improving, including public administration. And it is not something I believe we have been blind towards. We have embarked already for the present programming period on a big effort to improve the framework conditions for spending. Not sure I mentioned it, ex-ante conditionalities. We had loads of conditions which had to be fulfilled by those responsible for national or regional operational programs for them to be able to ultimately tap the funding. And it ranged from indeed the quality of the administrative structure to manage the funding received, to demonstrating that there were sound, for instance, sectoral spending plans in those sectors where the operational programs were meant to devote money. So a transport plan or a health plan if there were, for instance, investments in hospitals. Smart specialization strategies are another example. It is in fact an ex-ante conditionality for making any investment in innovative firms, for instance. So we have clearly looked at that. We also have put more stress on quality of public administration in general, which is a specific strand new for this period. And as I said, in fact, we want to go much further in that direction and look much more at how we can support structural reforms generally and the quality of public administration specifically. And I would end by saying that we also want to go even further in the direction of concentrating the means so that there is critical mass and so that there is real impact. And finally, I would say, prudently, but I would say indeed that it might be a happy coincidence that we will be faced with very strong budgetary constraints, which to me, as Pim suggested, will mean that we will have to go 1 or 2 or 3 steps further in the direction of using the available funds for leveraging, meaning going in the direction of financial instruments. Again, in this period, there has been a move in that direction. There will be more. And as Pim said, there are advantages in terms of quality of projects, in terms of disciplining and so on, of going in that direction. And more generally, I would say that given that the money will be tight, we might be perhaps at levels of aid intensity for the least developed parts of Europe, which might be then less worrisome also in terms of the negative side effects you have mentioned.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and I'll come to you, because I didn't see any other hands. Yes.
Okay, I'm André Torre from Paris University. My question is to Joachim Martins. How do you explain that at the same time, in Europe, you find a huge productivity mainly in big cities, and on the other hand, you realized and you said that most productivity came from rural areas near the cities? Does it mean that productivity comes from the rural area of the most urban regions in Europe?
I didn't really say that I didn't really say that, right? I don't think I said that. What I said is that the regional catching up is an important component of the aggregate productivity performance, okay? And one of the main drivers of this regional catching up is proximity to cities. So there is no contradiction in making cities better and helping rural regions to converge to the productivity frontier. That's, I think, what I said.
Okay. Is that okay? Well, I'm sorry. I have this task that I have. I have one question also. Do you have a question for Pim? Because no,
it's allowed.
No, because I had this question. I know there is a deeply felt wish here in Groningen for a high-speed railway connection to the Randstad. Did you just say that if Groningen will find 4 other municipalities here along the route of this high-speed railway track, then there might be an opportunity that EIB would be positive about that, because I thought I heard something like that.
That could well be the case.
Some people straightening up.
all projects, Barbara, by the bank are analyzed on their added value. You know, we have, and that was by structural funds policies, we have built some high-speed train connections where at a certain point on the high-speed train there were on average 10 passengers a day, which is not really economically viable. I don't think that is the way forward. It has to be an asset to your region, really a policy asset and not a liability, because it has to be maintained as well. But we never do more than 50%, so if you find other parties interested in financing this high-speed link, of course, don't hesitate to call me.
Thank you very much. Let me, before we close this plenary session, say something short about the program. It's here. What we have is quite a rich program to go. 4 policy topics spread over 2 plenaries of parallel sessions. What works for competitiveness between regions, and you could choose for another topic right before lunch. After this session, growing inequalities and their regional implications, and after lunch there are also 2 parallel sessions, local policy and happiness, or how to use a crisis as an accelerator for regional change and regional policy. And afterwards we close the policy day with an OECD panel discussion with 4 participants and a great chair. So then we wrap up the entire policy day, and afterwards there will be, I think, much room for discussion and socializing and so on. I wish you a very pleasant policy day, and I hope you get inspiration from the combination of policy and science, and I hope very wise policies come out of that. Have a great day.
Exactly. So I was just struck by this. Policy is actually driving this case at least, and the question is, to what extent is policy